a bit about what you have been doing for the last 5-6 years and what you're doing now.
So I, for the last 5 or 6 years, have been a director of Theos, which is a public theology think tank. And that's a confusing term because, of course, we believe that all theology is public. We believe in one life and there isn't a public-private split. But public theology is a way of describing theology that thinks about public issues, so social and political issues, and tries to bring theological reflection and research and media comment to issues in our society. And then prior to that, I worked in politics. My background's in basically politics in terms of working in politics, and then theology is my academic background. Okay,
so obviously you, in terms of how you can influence and how you can lead, you decided to go down the sort of politics route. Why do you think? Why was that important to you, and why would it be important to anybody here who may be thinking, what can I offer the world, and is politics something for me?
Yeah, I think often if we were to talk about, well, what is a way of being a Christian in the world, often probably the last place we would look is politics. But for me, it was really logical and natural that if I was serious about loving God and loving my neighbour as myself, then of course I'd want to get involved in the culture and in the institutions that affect the lives of my neighbours, especially the most vulnerable in society. So it was a very kind of logical sort of direction for me. What was interesting, though, was particularly when I was my first job was as a parliamentary researcher, and all my other colleagues there, they'd all done history or PPE or economics or whatever. Very few had done theology. So I still think there is a challenge out there. There's a challenge to the church to think of politics as a way to serve God and to love your neighbour. I think we're in a much better place than we used to be, but maybe we've still got a way to go.
Okay, so put you on the spot a little bit. What are some of the biggest challenges for Christians involved in politics? Because it can't really be an easy world to be in. And it seems like when we see it on TV or something, it seems like everyone's arguing or shouting at each other or going, yeah, or whatever in government. But obviously politics is more than that, isn't it? It's kind of everywhere locally and stuff as well. But it seems like there's just so many complex issues and difficult things. So I'm sure there must be struggles for Christians. What are some of the most difficult struggles that you perceive for Christians in that environment?
Yeah, I suppose when people think of politics, either at best they think of the West Wing. We talked about that in my session. And, does anyone like the West Wing here? Is that something that sort of... and we've obviously got a very kind of enthusiastic, non-apathetic electorate out there. But the West Wing, amazing kind of. And then the other side of it is basically, well, all politicians are basically corrupt and they're in it for themselves. And again, we were saying earlier that politicians in the ranking and the popularity stakes, if you are an estate agent, you're just about below a politician in terms of whether you're trusted or not. And journalists are even worse, of course. But politicians have had a bad press. So in a way, that's part of the challenge, really. If you're a Christian in politics, it's quite a lonely life in some ways. And the other part of it, which I think is a real challenge to the church, is certainly when I worked in an MP's office, the worst letters that we used to get were from Christians. And we used to have this little filing system where we kept the green ink letters that were either written literally in green ink or wax crayon, or they were just mad, really. But they were often from Christians who were very angry and who would just write in ways that were so un-Jesus-like, really. So again, it can be isolating. So that's a pressure. I think there's a pressure of increasingly, politicians are under a lot of scrutiny. So there's a lot of public pressure on them in terms of how they use their time, of course, how they use their money. And then also this sense of, actually, I think often we look at politicians and think they've got so much power, why don't they do something good with it? Actually, if you're a backbench MP, you feel really powerless. You feel you're so limited in what you can do. And yet, of course, there is such a lot you can do. You can be an advocate for people within your constituency and represent them in Parliament and that sort of thing. And then there's the pressures of it's a very sort of antisocial sort of job in some ways. So lots of people want to spend time with you, but usually because they want something from you. But then also you're working in London during the week, and then you have a constituency that might be hundreds of miles away that you need to get to on a Friday and at the weekend. And then sometimes the votes that take place, there was a vote a couple of weeks ago in the House of Lords, and, they were still voting at 2 o'clock in the morning. That's quite hard, on people. So there's all those challenges, I think.
That's great. Okay, so not everybody here is going to become an MP, surprise, surprise. But some people might, you never know. But just for kind of your normal average Christian who's trying to lead or influence in their sphere of society, could you just give us some kind of basic ways in which we might engage in the world of politics, or what is it that we can offer rather than just leave it all to those people in London who kind of work it out? Is there some role that we should be playing, and what could it be?
Definitely. I think the first sort of point to make is that politics isn't just about sitting on a green bench in Parliament, as nice as that might be. It's about being involved in our communities and in the life of the city. So politics is from the Greek word for city, which is polis. So it's being concerned about the well-being of the city. And so number one, I think there's a responsibility in all of us to be informed about the world that we live in, the city that we live in, the community that we live in. It's very difficult for us to pray about our city and community if we know nothing about it. So I would want to suggest that being informed in terms of blogs and news and listening to the news and the numerous sort of websites that are news-based is really important, and it's a really important spiritual discipline. And so, I won't say God is not pleased if we're not informed about the world that he's created. That's, serious. So being informed. Secondly, praying then into those situations. So prayer is a really politically subversive act. It's an amazing thing to do, to pray that God's kingdom would come and transform our communities and societies, and that his will would be done on earth as in heaven. Amazing. Then voting, obviously, is a really kind of obvious way to get involved. So as soon as you're 18, you get the opportunity to vote. And it does mean then that when you're 18, you have a responsibility to vote. And if you choose not to vote, I want to suggest that God is not pleased with that, because we live in a democracy, which means that every single person who has the vote has an opportunity to influence, and if they choose not to vote, then they're still influencing the outcome of elections, because someone gets in who might not have got in otherwise, sort of thing. And then the other way of getting involved is just joining political parties and getting involved as a school governor or a residents association or community action groups, or joining organisations like Theos to lobby government on issues. And we said this morning that it's quite a thought to think that the RSPB, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, has more members in it than in all the UK political parties put together, which is extraordinary that birds kind of attract such interest, but so depressing that the parties that are about the well-being of the whole of creation, including people, don't. And so just imagine if in the years ahead, every single person in this room, and over the next few weeks, in terms of who are part of One Life, were involved in a political party. That would just be absolutely extraordinary. The influence of that would be incredible, not least at a relational level, but also in the structures and policies of political parties. So I think there's a real challenge there to kind of think that, rather than politics necessarily being the last thing we do, maybe it might become one of the first things that we do.
Yeah, that's absolutely brilliant, and a real challenge to us, actually. I want to encourage you to hear that challenge and have a think about that and talk about it with each other, and work out, what's my response to the challenge that Paul has just brought to us. Zoe Hayes from Tear Fund. So Tear Fund are a partner with One Life, and so Zoe Hayes will be here tomorrow as well. So you could talk to Zoe about what Tear Fund do around politics and how they can help you become active in lobbying government, having a word, and being able to have your voice heard about different issues that are really important about the way culture is going and your life is going to be in the future. So Paul, just finally, as we wrap up, there's been lots of chat going on about the big society on TV, and probably quite a few people here might have heard of the big society and everything. It's one of David Cameron's buzzwords, and there's been loads of talk around it. Can you tell us what you understand it to be? Because lots of people have been talking about what they understand it to be. And then also just share with us what could our response be to David Cameron's ask for the big society, and what might our role be, and why is that important for us?
Yeah, well, for me, the big society is that in the past, I think there's been a tendency to think that there are basically two institutions in society that make a difference. So if you're on the left of politics, you think that the state has all the answers to all the problems in society, and we need to pass more laws to make society better. If you're on the right, obviously this is kind of, I'm exaggerating slightly, but if you're on the right, you tend to think that it's the market. So basically it's all to do with people having the ability to have money and to choose how to spend the money and use that responsibly, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the big society is basically saying both of those are wrong. So there are lots of, where we find meaning is not really in the state or the market, it's everything that's in between. So the big society is church, it's family, it's community, it's friends, it's those parts of our culture, our society, our common life where we find identity and significance and meaning and have relationships. And actually, when you think about it, they are the institutions that, matter most to people. If you think of the people that have, or the institutions that have really significantly impacted your life, it's unlikely that you'll think of, a big corporate firm, and it's unlikely you'll kind of think, if it wasn't for, the Blair government or the Thatcher government, life just, it would be so different. You don't think in those terms. You think of family, you think of community, you think of church. So that's the big society. And then in terms of opportunities, I guess I would say that the kind of big challenge to us is to say, this is the big society. So, the great thing about the big society is the church has already got there. The church has understood for 2,000 years what the big society is. Jesus, when he gathered disciples around himself, that was the big society. This group of people gathered around Jesus to make a difference, who existed not for themselves, but for the sake of God and for the world around them. And that, therefore, it's unsurprising that if you look at all the social activism that takes place throughout the UK, overwhelmingly, that's faith-inspired. It's usually church-based social action projects. And therefore, if the church, let's imagine the church just decided that it was going to close, for a week, the consequences to society would be disastrous, and the bill to the taxpayer would be ginormous. Because think of what churches do in terms of their social provision, their homeless shelters, their soup kitchens, mums and tots, youth work. The amount of youth work that is done by the church totally outstrips any other organisation. And often in the most deprived communities, when the post office is closed and the pub is no longer there, it's still the church that is involved and active in society, giving hope and meaning and significance to people. So the challenge for us is to just be the church, basically. Be the church, get involved, and use this opportunity that's presented by this kind of concept, the big society, to talk about that and to think about more creative ways of doing that.
Fantastic. So it is a really opportunity for us to kind of be living the lives that we're called to live in our churches and making a difference. And the government are saying that's great, that's the big society. Fantastic. Paul, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been really good, really insightful, and thank you for the challenges that you've brought to us this morning. It's great. Let's give Paul a round of applause.
Okay, guys, I hope you've been getting to know one another. I hope you've been taking opportunities